Stacey A. Shaw is an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at Brigham Young University. Her research interests include refugee resettlement, mental health, HIV prevention, religion, and spirituality and intervention research. She received her PhD in social work from Columbia University and her bachelor's and master's degree in social work from Brigham Young University. She has authored many publications, including but not limited to How do Risk Environment Factors Influence Perpetration of Partner Violence Among Migrant and Non-Migrant Men in Central Asia, published in the Journal of Urban Health, Assessing Mental Health and Service Needs Among Refugees in Malaysia, published in the International Journal of Social Referral, and Implications of World War II U.S. Refugee Resettlement Efforts of Cecilia Rozovsky and Varian Fry, published in the Journal of Migration History. Dr. Shaw has done research everywhere from Kazakhstan to Malaysia and was first drawn to social work because it allows us to understand challenges and inequalities, then intervene.
Dr. Shaw grew up in Portland, Oregon, but moved to Salt Lake during high school and claims both as her home. She enjoys hiking, skiing, the outdoors, and travel. A research trip to Uganda during her undergrad degree was the start of her very international career, and she plans to return to Malaysia this summer to continue her research. Dr. Shaw's research has focused on refugees, mental health, and homosexuality, but especially on intervention. While understanding problems is important, she feels it's much more important to do what she can to solve them. Her presentation today will detail her research trying to improve mental health among refugees. We will now turn the time over to Dr. Shaw for her presentation, Developing a Screening, Intervention, and Referral to Treatment Tool to Promote Mental Well-Being Among Refugee Women in Malaysia.
I would prefer to walk around and get in your face a little bit more, but I will try to still engage with you through speaking in the mic. So I know that this, for many of you, you're here for a class. Congratulations on making it to the end of the semester. And just take a moment to kind of honor that, celebrate finishing the winter semester. For those of you who are not a part of the class and who are here, thank you for being here, and I hope that this presentation will be relevant or interesting to all of you. So I'm talking about an SBIRT, a brief intervention, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in just a minute. But it's basically a brief mental health intervention that we developed and tested in Malaysia with refugees. So a few acknowledgements before I get into the meat of the presentation. I really appreciate the support of the BYU Women's Research Initiative, who funded part of this project. Also, this is a collaborative project and would not have been possible without my research team in Malaysia. Latifa Ali and Hamid Karim were the main research assistants that I worked with in implementing the project. And my colleague from Columbia University, Louisa Gilbert, was also fundamental in helping me think through some of the ideas behind establishing this project. We also worked with a number of organizations in Malaysia, the Malaysia Social Research Institute and the Rohingya Community School, who helped us have the needed places to recruit and also to conduct the interventions. So an overview of what I'll talk about today. I'll first give a little bit of information or background on context of forced migration globally and in Malaysia. Then I'll talk about the research that informed this project, then go into specifically the SBIRT model, as well as the research design overview, and then I'll talk about the specific components of the intervention, the SBIRT. Then I'll touch on the research findings and then also address implications and next steps of this research going forward. So I do have maybe 20, 25 minutes of content. So if you do have a question as I'm speaking, I'd welcome that, especially if it's something brief, clarifying, and I will repeat that on the mic so that we can make sure we do this right. Otherwise, if you have more extensive questions, I look forward to taking those at the end. Okay, so thinking about forced migration globally, what's happening in the world? Many of you, I'm sure, are aware or have heard about some recent increases over the last few years in the number of people who have been forced to leave their homes due to persecution or fear of persecution. And these numbers are really unprecedented. We're talking about 68+ million people who have been forced to leave their homes. Most of those are residing in their home countries, so they would be considered internally displaced people or IDPs. Once someone crosses an international border, they could be designated as a refugee or an asylum seeker. And most of those who have crossed a border and who are in this state of seeking asylum or seeking assistance are living in countries near where they've originated from. So they're in border countries, places such as Malaysia, where they're sort of trying to figure out what to do next and trying to survive. Many of those people, so about 25 million people, have been designated as meeting the legal definition of a refugee, and that status is granted by UNHCR. And it's important to have a sense of this broader context as we start thinking about the needs of these communities in different places, as well as how we can think about intervention to try to support some of these folks. And a really important piece to also note here is that when we talk about eventual resettlement to a country such as the United States, the numbers of people who are accessing that as a permanent solution are extremely small. So this was about 100,000 people, and this was, I think, fiscal year 2016. So the more recent numbers in 17 and 18 have dropped and are even lower than that. We also have a few million people seeking asylum in countries such as Germany and the European Union, and but most of those who have had to flee their homes are residing in middle income or developing countries. So that kind of gives our background, some similar information here. This is all drawn from UNHCR. So if you'd like a little more information, I'd be happy to share these slides and resources with you about where people are coming from and where they're going. It's a really important issue that certainly deserves our attention. So to talk about Malaysia, so there's about 163,000 people, refugees and asylum seekers, who are currently living in Malaysia. Most of them have come from nearby, Myanmar. So this is Malaysia here in red, and most are coming from Myanmar. And then others, the other 10% are coming from all over. So we have people from the Middle East, from North Africa, that we've also done some work with. Living in Malaysia, there is this sense of, you've escaped the persecution that you're fleeing, so that's good. But there's a lot of challenges where people are not legally welcomed to live there, and they're not able to legally work or to access various services. So they're sort of tolerated, barely, to be there. And the government allows UNHCR to operate, and so people are able to gain refugee status. It often takes years to go through that interview process. And then some will be referred to consideration for third country resettlement to places such as the United States or to Australia, primarily. So 8,000 people were accepted and gone through or went through the resettlement process in 2016. So you can see a few people are accessing that as a resource, and that's primarily why people are coming to Malaysia to seek for that solution. Although the vast majority will not be able to access that, and some will wait for years or decades and generally not be able to get through that program. So experiencing violence is very common, harassment, people are often detained. It's a very stressful living situation. So a little bit about the research I've done in Malaysia and kind of what that has looked like. So I spent a year there before I came here to BYU as a visiting professor at the University of Malaya, and really loved working there. It was great. I first started focusing more on HIV-related research, and then also incorporated some of these refugee-related questions and concerns, and that's kind of taken over as my larger agenda for now. So in the screening research that we've done, we found nearly universal experience of mental health or emotional distress symptoms. Of the research we've done with both Burmese or people from Myanmar as well as from other countries, about 97% demonstrate experiencing emotional distress, meaning depression, anxiety, and trauma. And on average, when we measure distress, the scores are really high. So the average score, or the cutoff score for being considered to be positive for experiencing emotional distress, would be around 12, and the scores we're seeing are generally in the 30s or more. So after assessing some of these challenges and talking to people about their needs, their situations, what might work for them in terms of service provision, we developed a few interventions to try to respond and put some support into addressing this need and filling some of these gaps. So we first did a group mental health intervention. It was an 8-week group, and we did this with women from Afghanistan, and found that it was highly effective in reducing emotional distress, and that those gains were actually maintained over time, over a 3-month follow-up period. We used a randomized design in looking at this question and implementing this intervention. So we know that the effect, the change in distress scores, was related to the intervention. So that was really exciting to see. It was a relatively small study. We did 4 different groups with about 10 women each. Then building on that, we talked to participants about what else we could look at, what other needs they felt they had, and decided in response to build a parenting intervention. And so that we did next with people from Afghanistan as well as from Myanmar, Rohingya specifically. And also are still finishing kind of the analysis process for that, but we did that with 9 different groups. So we had about 90 participants and found that that has been effective in reducing some outcomes. We're still trying to finish the analysis, and hopefully we'll be able to share those findings soon. So this is our starting point for trying to see what's going on over there, what can we do, are there ways we can help, and what type of impact would these interventions have. And I should make note that the mental health group, it didn't get rid of distress, okay? So distress did not go away entirely, but we saw a major drop in distress. And so that kind of led us to think about, well, what more could we do? Is there something that we could do that would be perhaps easier to implement? Because an 8-week group is fairly intensive, and for a lot of people who have major barriers to transportation or who are trying to work or otherwise take care of family, meet other responsibilities, they're just not able to make it regularly. So we thought about something that would be a little more flexible and perhaps condense those skills that we built through the group process into a brief individualized session that we could do in a more flexible way with an individual at any point in time. And we also looked at other research that's been done along these lines. So we drew from the SBIRT model. It's actually been developed in substance use treatment and has been used pretty widely in helping people build some skills, access resources in that setting. And also I drew from experience in a SBIRT model that we implemented related to intimate partner violence with women in the criminal justice system in New York. So drawing on some of those previous models that had been done in other settings, and then looking at what we knew about the experiences of refugees in Malaysia, we said, why don't we try to build a brief model to address mental health among this community and see if that will be able to have a similar sort of gain or impact when compared to something more intensive like the 8-week group that is just very difficult to get to work for everyone. The other piece with this individualized session is a little more tailored to an individual rather than an entire group. So we kind of like that idea of flexibility and allowing us to talk a little bit more about the person's unique experiences. So that's where we came up with this model, and what it stands for: screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment. So it's pretty descriptive. That's what we're trying to do. That's the generic term that's been used in other fields. But as far as I know, this is the first time something like this has been implemented in mental health services with refugees. So it's a 1-session appointment or meeting. It takes about 45 minutes. And the caseworker would meet privately with the individual to go through these different stages of the intervention. And the purposes, the main stages that we went through were: 1, education. So education about mental health in the context of forced migration. 2nd, we do a screening. So we're trying to see, okay, well, what's your experience with distress? Then we'll talk about some skills, skill building. So we talk about coping strategies and tools that people could use to deal with distress that may be helpful for them. And then lastly, we'll talk about goal setting and referral to other services that they may need based on their goals. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of those components in just a minute, but first, to give you a sense of the research design or how we actually implemented this, we recruited folks within the Rohingya and Afghan communities in Malaysia in the Kuala Lumpur area and implemented the intervention at people's homes, neighborhoods, or community service centers, schools, some of the places I mentioned at the beginning. We randomly assigned participants to either be in an initial intervention group or in a waitlist control group, so that we would be able to compare over time people's experience based on the intervention. And we compare people that had the intervention to those that did not have the intervention over time, because there may be a lot of other factors that influence changes in people's distress scores over time beyond the intervention. So randomization allows us to see, does this specifically impact those changes, or are we able to control and account for other things that may be impacting those changes in scores? All of the sessions were conducted in people's languages and were conducted with research assistants from their communities. And here are some of my colleagues. Latifa, this is at MSRI, the Malaysia Social Research Institute, and this is Hamid. This is the community school where we did a lot of the interventions. So we had, also just want to note that we did have approval, human subjects approval for all study procedures, both locally and internationally, meaning here at BYU. So 85 people were in the study, and we had about half and half randomized to the initial group and to the waitlist control group. So now, to go through the actual intervention, what did this look like? What did it include? So the education piece we'll start with, and here's some of the script. So we actually have it written out, and the researcher could read this. They could sort of put it into their own words. But here's some of the things we would talk about at the beginning. So we introduce the session, introduce our role, and this is after we've gone through the consent process and kind of worked out all those details. So we'll start out with talking about, living in a new place can be difficult, especially if you've experienced separation or hardship before or after coming here. Many people who have gone through difficult experiences have stress, sadness, and anger as a result. Though your experience may be different, here are some of the emotions that you might find yourself encountering. And we have quite a few images like this to kind of help us look together. Let's talk about some of the different feelings or somatic symptoms that you may be experiencing. These type of feelings and experiences might make it hard to cope with life. We want to talk about some of these feelings and experiences today. Then we go on to say, first we'll talk about stress and worry. You may be experiencing a new environment here in Malaysia. You might be worried about your life here or about what is happening in your home country. People often experience the same thoughts over and over and worry about things that they cannot control. Our previous study in Malaysia found that nearly all people we talk to experience stress and worry. Do you or people that you know experience worry? Okay, so you can see we're trying to sort of normalize this experience and say that this is common. When you're in this context of migration, you're in a place where there's a lot of challenges and barriers, it might be overwhelming. Other people that we've worked with have struggled to adapt and deal with some of these stressors. So this is a way to sort of get the conversation going and help them explore, is this something that you're experiencing? And if so, let's see if there's some ways that we can look at responding to that. So that's just an example. I won't go through the whole intervention, although I do have it here. If you want to look in more detail, I'd be happy to share that. But then we'll go through talking about anxiety, so symptoms of anxiety. We'll talk about sadness and common symptoms of sadness. And then we'll also talk about reliving past experiences or post-traumatic stress and some of the symptoms that go along with that. And as we're going through that whole education process, we're asking some questions. We're trying to gain a sense of how this person's experience might connect with some of these themes and how this might apply to them. So the next portion, after we've gone through that education section, we'll shift into screening. So we'll introduce this by saying something like, I would like to understand a little more about your experience now before we talk about strategies that can be used to help cope with symptoms. I'm going to ask you a few questions and we'll mark down your answers. You can choose not to answer any of the questions. And we have 15 questions. These are just a couple examples. And so we'll ask people to think about the level of symptoms that you've had or symptoms that have bothered you in the past month. And we'll rate each of these on a scale from not at all to extremely. So, for example, feeling down, sad, or blue most of the time. Would you say in the past 30 days, has that been your experience? Not at all, a little bit, moderately, quite a bit, or extremely? There's no right or wrong answers. We're just trying to get a sense of your best assessment of these symptoms and how often you might be experiencing these. So we'll go through those and kind of tick off. Actually, we'll fill this out in Qualtrics to give the person's scores on each of these. And then we'll give them a little bit of feedback. So if the person's score is higher than 12, that's that cutoff point for distress on the first 14 items, or higher than 5 on the last overall distress thermometer, we'd give some feedback saying, it looks like you're experiencing some distress. Let's spend some time now talking about ways to manage stress and look at some possible supportive resources that might be helpful for you. If the person's scores are lower, then we'd say, it doesn't look like you're experiencing stress right now or you're not distressed right now, but We know things can change, and we know that you might have others in your life that may be experiencing distress. So let's talk about some things that might be helpful for you in the future or for others that you know. So then we go into the skill building, and we'll introduce this by saying, now we'd like to talk about some tools that might be helpful if you feel sad or worried. These tools can have several benefits, such as lowering stress, helping us accept our emotions, improving physical symptoms, increasing flexibility of body and mind, or healthy ways of moving, feeling, and being. Okay, so that's what we're going for in some of these skills that we'll talk about for the next few minutes. So first, we start out talking about stretching. And I'll give this one a little more detail and then just kind of give a quick review of the other skills we talk about. So stretching. Stretching is one way that you can relax both your body and your mind. You can stretch when you feel sad or worried. You can take a few minutes every day to stretch. Even before you go to bed, it might help you sleep better to do some stretching exercises. So I'll give you a handout that shows some examples of different stretches you could do. And let's actually take a few moments just to practice stretching together. So I invite you, if you would be willing, to do this with me right now. These are actually skills that can help all of us, and they help me every day, all of these skills. So for the first stretch, we're going to move our head slowly forward and then slowly back, okay? So don't go too far in a way that would cause any strain, but just try to feel that movement in your neck and then come back. And if you feel comfortable, you can also move your head from side to side. This can really help relieve any tension that you might feel in your neck. Okay, after you've done that a few times, we'd also like to try another stretch where we actually stand up. So if you feel comfortable, you don't have to, but if you'd like to, you can join us by standing up. We'll do a stretch where we bend over and try to touch our toes. Okay, don't strain, don't push too hard. If you can't get all the way down there, that's fine. But this will help strengthen your back and your legs. So go ahead and reach down. You can hold that for just a moment and then slowly come back up. And now, for a moment while you're standing, you think about any other areas of your body that you might like to stretch. Maybe there's areas of soreness or areas where you hold some tension in your body. Think about, is there some other part that you'd want to reach out, want to feel that tension or movement in your body, whatever works for you. And as you're stretching, there's a helpful affirmation together that I'd like to have us say or think of. And what I'd like to say is, as I become more flexible in my body, may I become more flexible in my thoughts and in my emotions, and may I know how to adjust to each new situation. Okay, so let's go ahead and say this together. I know this is a little bit long, so just do your best if you can read it up here in the quotes, starting here with as. Okay, so we'll start together. As I become more flexible in my body, may I become more flexible in my thoughts and in my emotions, and may I know how to adjust to each new situation. Okay, thank you. So if you want to do one more stretch, go for it. And when you're ready to sit, feel free. Thank you for joining me with that. So then we take a few minutes to talk about how does it feel to do some of these stretches? Is there awkwardness? Should we think about anything that's not quite working? Does it help you feel kind of aware of your body? And then encourage the person kind of connect to what other people have experienced. Many people find stretching to be helpful in the morning after waking up, right after bed, or right before bed, or after returning home. And we'll talk through, when might this be something that you could do? And when do you think it might be helpful for you to do so? So if we had more time, we could discuss that together. But I'd encourage you to think about, is there more ways that you could bring flexibility or stretching into your life? And then we'll go on to talking about some other skills. So deep breathing. Deep breathing is also a really important way of being present in the body, finding ways to calm and soothe ourselves, and especially in dealing with feelings of anxiety. So we'll talk about, focusing on your breathing can help you relax and focus on the present moment. It is especially useful if you find that you are breathing quickly because you are worried or thinking about past experiences. So then we'll talk about different types of breathing, and we'll practice together both that breathing up in the chest and breathing deep below in the belly, and try to help people see how to have those kind of deeper breaths that help the person sort of calm the body. Then we'll talk about mindfulness. So mindfulness is when we focus our thoughts and feelings on the present moment. It helps us clear our minds, relieve stress, and balance our emotions. And so this is really learning to tap into our senses, both sight, our hearing, listening, feeling, smell, touch. Being more aware of each of our senses, what information they're taking in, and trying to welcome the things that they're taking in can help us calm and accept who we are and where we are. Then getting a little more complicated, we'll talk about emotion regulation. So when we experience difficult memories and feelings, it can be helpful to be aware of those feelings and find ways to manage them. So this process involves emotional distancing, emotion shifts, providing compassion and comfort. So we'll talk about some ways to do each of those things. Then we'll also share the value of spiritual practices, recognizing that there's a wide variety of spiritual practices that many people find to be helpful, and what might some of those that are helpful to you in managing your stress or helping you be present in the moment. Social support is another huge resource. So being able to reach out to others in times of stress or struggle and finding comfort and relief through those relationships. And then lastly, taking care of yourself. So taking time to do things that you enjoy is also a really important part of healing and well-being. And even simple things like enjoying a cup of tea or some other beverage of your choice. These are more common in Malaysia, maybe. Taking a walk, creating art, writing, dancing, listening to music. I mean, simple things. What is it that helps you feel relaxed? What is it that helps you feel calm? And can you find a way to honor those things and make time for those things in your life as something that's important, not just sort of a superfluous extra thing, but something essential. Okay, so we go through all of these skills together and we talk about how they might be personalized or tailored to the individual that we're working with and what they might look like in their situation. And then we segue into the last part of the intervention where we talk about goal setting. So we'll say, for example, sometimes when we're struggling, it can be helpful to set some goals of what would we like to address, what would we like to change. If there's maybe some things you've been struggling with, some difficult memories from the past or feelings of worry or sadness that you've been dealing with, are there one or two of the techniques that we talked about today that might be helpful for you to try in the future or this next week? Or if we think about a bigger goal that you would like to address, what's something that you would want to accomplish right now? So after thinking through a few goals, then we'll talk about potential services where someone could get additional help if needed. So we'll go through a list of resources. Now we'll discuss some resources available to you that might be able to help you in reaching the goals that you've discussed or addressed or that we've written down. So of this list of resources, and we have resources in different areas that are available in Malaysia, and some of them are more related to, basic food assistance or health or things like that. It's not strictly about mental health. So we'd say, are any of these resources something that might be helpful to you? And then are there any services that you would like to access this next week? And if so, is there something we could do to help make sure that happens? So that's pretty much the intervention. After going through all of that, we'll wrap things up, thank them for their time and conclusion, see if they have any questions. Okay? So that's the intervention. That's kind of the whole flow. And now let me tell you a little bit about what we learned from doing this study. So our participants of the 85, you can see we had 41 Rohingya refugees and 44 from Afghanistan. The average age of our participants was 35, and we had about slightly more than half, about 2/3 that were female. Most of the participants were married and had children and had been in Malaysia for an average of 4 years. You can see the significant indicators here that show slight differences across the two groups. If you want to see some of those, I think people from Myanmar had been here for slightly longer than those from Afghanistan, and it looks like the Afghan community, our participants were more likely to be married, more likely to be female as well. Most participants had no formal education, and most actually experienced food insecurity. That means that in the last 90 days, they did not have enough money for food. Less experienced homelessness, meaning in the last 90 days, they didn't have a place to stay, but a sizable number, almost 20%. And then the pretest score, so this was the emotional distress score that we measured. If you remember, the cutoff was 12. So the average score was 39 at the baseline, meaning before receiving the intervention, and that was not different across the two communities, not statistically significant in a difference. So that's kind of what our sample looks like, the people who participated in this program. And what did we learn about the actual intervention? So in the regression modeling that we conducted, we compared the outcome that we looked at. The dependent variable was the post score, and that means the score at 30 days after completing the intervention. So if you remember, we have the two groups. The arm signifies the two groups, the intervention group and the control group. So we found that those who participated in the intervention, the initial intervention group, did have a decline in their distress score at 30 days after, when compared to the control group who did not receive the intervention. And if you see the difference here, remember the average score was 39 at baseline. So at 30-day follow-up, those who were in the intervention, their score dropped to 27 on average, whereas those who were in the waitlist group, their score was about the same at 40. So again, it's not getting rid of distress, but it is a significant decrease that we would see to be meaningful and statistically significant. So that was good to see. And then also just to clarify in terms of the design, so those who were on the wait list group, they actually received the intervention at 30 days because we felt like we had an ethical obligation to provide those services to all the participants in our study. But we didn't actually track those participants over time, so we didn't see how that affected them 30 days later, but we're assuming it would be quite similar. A couple other things that we found from this regression model and analysis conducted was that pre-score was associated with post-score. So that means if you had a higher level of distress at baseline, you tended to have higher distress at 30 days. That kind of makes sense, that there would be some similarity in the level of distress that's maintained over time. We also found that being female was associated with higher distress, which is relatively common both within and outside of refugee communities in terms of mental health. And interestingly, though, we found that the intervention had a stronger impact on distress among Afghan participants. So it was more significant for those from the Afghan community. And I've been thinking a little bit about why that may be the case, and I'm not totally sure, but I think it might be that the Afghan community is more isolated and it's smaller. And I think, had they been there for less time? Yeah, they've been there for a shorter amount of time as well. So they may feel less supported in the case that the intervention was more powerful for them or it was more needed for them. The main outcome that we considered here was distress score, but the other thing we wanted to look at was access to services, because if you remember, the intervention did have a major focus on helping people to connect to services, and so we wanted to see if that over time, like at 30 days, if people who were in the intervention were more likely to access various services. And we found that it did not. So there was no difference in service access, and there was basically no service access at 30 days for either group. And so that suggests to me that although we did have this list of resources, people didn't really feel like those resources were going to be helpful to them, or they weren't actually able to access them, or there were other barriers that sort of led to those services not being accessed and those needs not being met. Because the needs certainly were there. Okay, so what do we take away from this? I think we can see first that this tool can be relatively easy to use. It does have potential for alleviating distress. It's relatively low resource to implement. More research is certainly needed to figure out how effects vary by group, how this might need to be tailored to different communities. Definitely a need for enhancing community resources in places like Malaysia where there's just very limited support available. This limits in potential influence is also important to note. Okay, this is like a very small type of Band-Aid approach, right? To try to say, let's help you cope with some of your stress. We're not able to actually change the extremely stressful environment, though, that people are living in. And that is a reality that forced migrants are experiencing around the world. So as we try to provide some basic supports, it's not to say that those things aren't valuable. I think they are needed, but we also need to be thinking much bigger in terms of how can we improve their living situation in Malaysia, what policies can change to help things be better for people there, what opportunities can be provided on a much larger scale, and then what can we do about more durable solutions, whether that be helping people go back to their homes, stay permanently and legally in places of first asylum like Malaysia, or resettle to third countries like the United States or other places where they could kind of have a permanent sense of freedom and opportunity to rebuild their lives. So where we're going next with this research, I will be in Malaysia next month, and a major purpose of that trip will be to share a lot of these findings that we're just getting to finishing up the analysis and able to share. So we'll be talking with our participants, community leaders, and other folks from agencies and UNHCR about what we've learned, looking at how we might be able to expand this or modify it in different communities. I'm also thinking about a multimedia version of the tool, if there's something that people could actually just complete on a tablet rather than having a caseworker go through it with them. And then we could also have videos where people talk about their experiences. In the SBIRT I mentioned at the beginning that we conducted in New York with women related to intimate partner violence, we tested a multimedia version compared to a caseworker delivered version and found that they had very similar effects. So I think that's a promising opportunity to be able to disseminate this much more widely. And then, of course, advocacy for additional solutions and resources for migrants is I'd say, the most important focus. So that's my presentation. I really appreciate your kind attention and listening, and I welcome any questions you have for the last few minutes.
Using her research in the field, Dr. Stacey A has worked with refugee women in Malaysia to improve the existing mechanisms that respond to mental health concerns. The mental health issues that refugee women grapple with should be taken seriously in order to ensure a better quality of life and easier transition into their new reality. Access to coping skills that prevent the long-term consequences of bottled-up emotional distress give women more power and control over their well-being. Teaching healthy coping mechanisms empowers them to be in tune with the complex emotions they experience as part of being a refugee, and then learn to manage them in a healthy way. Empowered women empower women, and the networks of support women are able to provide each other will ultimately lead to women understanding their worth and finding hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. We have seen this in many other women, like Maria de Pena of Brazil. She was empowered when she turned her trauma from domestic abuse into motivation to prevent other Brazilian women from having the same experience. Asma Khader, the founder of Women's Learning Partnership at Jordan, said that, quote, "It is very important to make sure that refugee women know that there are international frameworks that support them. There are women who have gone through the same experiences as they have and survived, and were able to claim their rights. Refugees are not simply people who are recipients of help, but people who are active in designing their own community as refugees. We approach refugees as potential leaders so that the women will be able to lead their families and communities in the future toward a more democratic society with greater respect for women and girls," unquote. In order for refugees to be able to turn their experiences into activism and advocacy, their basic needs of emotional support must be met first. Going forward, the SBIRT model will need to be applied under community partners and research assistance, while also enabling refugee women to monitor the other women in their community and foster the SBIRT measures among themselves. While there is much work to be done to research how these systems can be implemented and improved, we can be certain that countless future generations of people will feel the positive impact that comes from providing refugee women with the resources necessary to overcome their circumstances. We'll now turn the time over for our Q&A session.
Okay, so we will now have the Q&A session. Dr. Shah, do you want to go?
Yes.
We can ask. Okay, so if any of you have questions, just feel free to line up behind me.
And I'll ask the first question. My question is, how did you become interested in the specific demographic of refugee women? And what are some ways that we can be involved with refugee women if we are interested?
Thank you for your great question. So I am a social worker. That's my background. I worked in refugee resettlement for a few years in Salt Lake in maybe 2007 to 10 or so. And so that was really my first in-depth connection with this issue and this population. And I loved working with this community, just amazing people, such different backgrounds, working so hard to adjust to life here in the US. And so that kind of built naturally into an interest in people's refugees' experiences elsewhere, outside of the United States as well. I definitely think there's a specific interest in women, but I also would love to work with men too. So women are more open to participating in some of our groups and activities just because they're a little more flexible. They're less likely to be working in Malaysia where their husbands are often not available. And that's partly why we developed this brief intervention model, so we could try to reach more men and people that were less flexible. So to answer your second question about ways to get involved, there are not a lot of refugee households living here in Provo. So if you're able to get up to Salt Lake, there's a lot of things going on. There's organizations where you can volunteer. You could be a family mentor or an English tutor, or if any skills that you have could be applied in different ways. So I'd encourage you to look into that if that's something you're interested in. In addition, there's a huge need for just understanding. So I think trying to learn more and raise awareness about the needs of forced migrants worldwide would be really valuable, and hopefully something that could influence your civic engagement. So for example, the way that you vote, taking that into consideration in trying to pressure our representatives to actually do more about this issue, and also finding ways for us to do more, through whether that be through learning, through sharing, through voting, through donations, through service, whatever you can do. Thanks.
Hi, I just had a question about the research. I really liked talking about the multimedia presentations at the end and how that can be just as effective than a one-on-one mentor. And I feel like that's a great way to scale this effort. I understand that group therapy is sometimes just as effective as, or more so than individual therapy. Is there a way, have you researched at all group therapy settings, and if that's successful among refugees, or if that's doesn't hold totally true?
Yes, so I mentioned very briefly the group that we did with women from Afghanistan, and that was an 8-week group that drew from the same principles that we talked about in this SBIRT model. So it's drawing from a culturally adapted cognitive behavioral therapy approach, where we're really trying to focus on emotion regulation and dealing with somatic symptoms. And so that was 8 weeks of basically doing the same skills that we described today. So like the stretching, the breathing, some of the emotion regulation, we just did that basically over and over and tried it in new ways, and asked the next week how it went for you, and had people share their experiences together with what they were learning and what they were trying and different ways that they were coping, and then also just about their experiences living in Malaysia. So that was really effective. Yeah, that had a major impact on distress, and it had a stronger effect than, we haven't actually compared them statistically, but the drop was bigger. It was more like a drop by half that was maintained over 3-month follow-up, whereas this one was a significant drop that was maintained over 30 days. So I think the group model is very effective, but it is difficult to get people to be able to actually attend for 8 weeks, and that's one of the bigger challenges. So yeah, thank you.
So you mentioned that your intervention had a section talking about religiosity and how spiritual beliefs can help you. So what role do you think that religiosity played in helping refugees?
That's a good question. I do think it can have a very, very powerful role, especially specific spiritual practices that are helpful to that individual. So that's what we would talk about, is like, what are some of those practices that might be useful for you? And a lot of the practices that people talked about or shared with us were things like prayer, meditation, reading of the Quran, or reading scriptural materials, collective forms of worship, chanting, things like that. So I think those do have a really powerful impact. A lot of our participants talked about that trust in God, relying on God, that higher power will be able to help them get through this, or that anything good actually comes from God or comes from a higher power. So as they're living with all of this chaos and stress, there's a real search for that sense of meaning and sense of like some greater thing that you can trust and rely on that will protect and guide you. So that was really interesting to see. There are challenges in some cases related to religious experience where we have religious minority groups in host countries that have different traditions. And you can see a lot of that in the United States with people of Muslim faith and background, and you can see some of that in other parts of the world too. And so that leads to stress. It doesn't, from what I've seen, it doesn't lead to religion being less important or less meaningful, but it does lead to a lot of added strain and fear where people are afraid they're going to be targeted or discriminated against because of being different. So I think that's something that we also need to look at, both in providing individual level supports and also trying to enhance environments of acceptance and support in these host countries. Thank you. I'm not sure what time we're supposed to end. 10 till? Okay, any last questions?
I think that we'd like time for a few more questions if anyone has.
I was a bit curious. On one of the slides, you said sadness, and then in parentheses you said depression. Do you use those terms synonymously? And if so, I was kind of wondering why.
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, sadness and depression are very different things. And when we talk about depression, that can also mean quite a variety of things to different people. And so we do need to be cautious. And when we're talking about depression, are we talking about an actual diagnosis and looking at, meeting symptom criteria for like a major depressive disorder was way beyond the scope of what we're doing here. So we are generally using more kind of conversational type of language, so things like sadness. But we do reference depression because some of the items in the assessment are referring back to depression. So we're sort of connecting to that, but not wanting to get too specific. So we wouldn't have to actually mention depression. And that is an important clarification as well. When we talk about mental health, we actually don't even use that language of mental health very often in these type of interventions because there's a lot of stigma around mental health, both in this community and many other communities, where people would feel like, oh, I'm not schizophrenic, I don't have a serious disease or whatever, I'm not crazy. And so we use more terms like well-being, distress, and things like that that are the reality that, people are not experiencing like a severe and persistent mental illness. What they're experiencing is stress because of a very challenging life situation they're going through. And so that's what we're trying to kind of tap into, but we do have a few connections to mental health language. So thank you.
I'm a neuroscience major. I kind of snuck in a little bit later, so I don't know if you addressed this at all, but I was curious about what kind of more neuroscientific collaboration may be going on as far as like informing these kind of interventions, and where you think there would be a gap where neuroscience could help kind of.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there's a gap. I would be interested to see what perspectives neuroscience might be able to bring in terms of, there are other like body-mind connections that we could be thinking of. The way that we talk about symptoms of distress and emotional distress is very much focused on like somatic symptoms. So the way that your body is responding to stress, because that's how most of the people we work with talk about their symptoms. So I think there could be some interesting questions to look at there with the role of the brain and how maybe that sort of understanding could help us think about other ways to educate and help people see those connections. Because that's certainly what we're dealing with, but we're not really thinking about that background. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Done.
Okay, well, that's all we have time for today. We'd like to thank all of you for coming here for this presentation. We'd like to thank Dr. Stacey A for being here. Let's give her another round.
Thank you. Thanks.